Alright guys, Wes here, welcome back to the channel, and what if I told you the God of War trilogy is getting a remake? As you know, God of War is one of Sony's most iconic franchises, but the fan base has been a tad bit in the dark whenever it comes to the next chapter. The Norse timeline was wrapped up with God of War Ragnarok, and while we know God of War 6 is in development, Sony is seemingly going to make us wait a long time before the next installment in the series. But what if Sony has a plan to hold us over until the next God of War? Well, according to new leaks and rumors, God of War 1 and potentially the entire trilogy is being remade. Is this what Bluepoint has been up to lately? Let's go ahead and talk about it. So before you write off the God of War remake rumors as a bunch of hopium, let's go ahead and go over the evidence that tells us that something is cooking in the back end. You may have heard of Christopher Judge, you know, the actor that plays Kratos in the Norse era, and he was reportedly asked to voice match Terrence Carson, the OG voice of Kratos, for an unknown project. The rumors became so widespread that Judge actually tweeted out in December that nobody at Santa Monica Studios had asked him to do any voice matching. However, he also said that someone else asked them to do voice matching for a character he did not specify. Now this raises a ton of questions because voice matching is very different from traditional voice acting. Plus, Christopher Judge was very careful in this tweet to say that it wasn't Santa Monica Studios who approached him to do voice matching, but rather a different studio. Well, as it happens, it's currently believed that Santa Monica is not the one actually working on a God of War remake, but rather Bluepoint Studios, the same team that made the remakes of Demon's Souls and Shadow of the Colossus. So looking at this tweet from Christopher Judge, we can actually confirm quite a few things. Firstly, we can confirm that he's not doing the voice work for the undisclosed game. Secondly, we can confirm that the undisclosed game features characters that were previously voiced by someone other than Christopher Judge. And thirdly, we can confirm that the game is not being worked on by Santa Monica Studios. And I don't know about you guys, but it awfully sounds like that there's some kind of secret God of War project in the works right now. But let's keep diving into the evidence because there's a lot more to go over. Now, not too long ago, it was discovered that Santa Monica is currently looking for a senior producer, and this is tied to a tweet that was made by David Gibson, the current animation director at Santa Monica, saying that they were working on, quote, something special. Now, I know that we've already established that if a God of War remake is happening, it's most likely being worked on by Bluepoint, but that doesn't mean Santa Monica wouldn't be involved at all, as currently Santa Monica is in control of the God of War IP, so it's safe to assume that Santa Monica Studios would be in constant communication with whoever was doing the grunt work on the God of War remake. So if Santa Monica is looking for a new senior producer, it could be because they want someone trustworthy to look over the project, or it could mean that the existing God of War team is already consulting with another studio for the remake, and the new senior producer is meant to pick up the slack on Santa Monica's next project. The same goes for David Gibson saying that they were working on something, quote, special. Everything ties back to Santa Monica Studios possibly consulting with another studio to get a remake of one of their IP off the ground. We already knew that Santa Monica Studios themselves wouldn't be making a remake because they're already hard at work on both God of War 6 and whatever the new IP that Cory Barlog is working on. But if development on a God of War remake is being outsourced to another studio, SMS would still heavily be involved with the process, even if they're not the ones doing the development. I keep going back to the idea of Bluepoint being the studio tasked with the actual development of God of War remake, and I'll go ahead and explain my reasoning for that because once again, there is a ton of actual evidence to support it. A while back, Bluepoint's president confirmed that they were working on two projects, an original game and a beloved remake. Now, it's been heavily rumored recently that there is a remake of Uncharted 1 in the works, but it's not believed that Bluepoint are the ones who have been picked for the project. Bluepoint has done amazing work with melee-focused remakes over the last years like Shadow of the Colossus and Demon's Souls, and they provided support on God of War Ragnarok, and they were the ones who made the PS3 God of War collection back in the day. So even if they've never made a God of War game, they have all of the qualifications for being the team tasked with the remake. Whenever it comes to a big remake like God of War 1 and potentially the trilogy, I would not trust any other studio besides Santa Monica and Bluepoint to make this happen. So hopefully if Sony did indeed greenlight it, then they picked Bluepoint to do the job. Now, in addition to all of that evidence that we discussed, there was also a pretty huge leak that happened not too long ago that came from a rather credible source and insider, suggesting that everything we've talked about in this video so far is in service of a remake of the original God of War game and potentially the entire OG trilogy. According to Special Nick of Xbox Era, who has correctly leaked a number of games over the last few years, Sony is currently working on something big for God of War's 20th anniversary, which will be set in 2025. A Special Nick suggested that the 20th anniversary of the franchise will be celebrated with a remastered trilogy collection that will either be announced this year or next year before launching in 2025. Obviously, a remastered trilogy collection is pretty different from a true remake, but it's possible that both stories are true at the same time. We've had several examples of franchises that get full remakes of one entry alongside hefty remasters or HD ports of others. The one that comes to mind is obviously the Master Chief Collection. So what if the God of War 1 remake is real and it's bundled with high definition definition ports or remasters of 2 and 3. Then again, it's also totally possible that Nick Baker's intel was just a long game of telephone, and what he was told was a remaster is in reality Bluepoint's remake of the original game. But then again, it's also possible that Bluepoint's remake of the original game is actually a remake of the entire trilogy, which would make Special Nick's intel of a trilogy re-release technically true, just not as a remaster. Now, there's a lot of conflicting information going around right now about how exactly the original God of War game is going to be brought to modern PlayStation, but the fact that there's this much buzz around it typically means that at least one of the stories is true, and that's super exciting because it means one way or another classic God of War is going to be coming back very soon. Now, one last piece of the rumor mill that I want to go over is a tweet that came from Oathbreaker, a notable figure in the God of War community, and according to a tweet from them, Oathbreaker claims that there is going to be an amazing year ahead for God of War fans, suggesting that there is some huge news coming in the very near future. So unless God of War 6 is getting revealed this year, which I think is very unlikely, my guess is we're going to be getting a confirmation of a God of War remake before the end of the year, and then it will launch in 2025 as a part of the 20th anniversary. And sure, the quote amazing news could be the long rumored Atreus spinoff game, but I'm also not sure that that would be how Sony decides to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the IP. I'm personally still of the opinion that the Atreus game exists, or at least it did at some point, and it will come out eventually. But when it comes to the amazing news that's coming out before the major anniversary for God of War, I think all signs are pointing towards some kind of re-release of the original game, be it a remake or a hefty remaster. Now, with all of this being said, I'd like to talk about how Bluepoint or whoever is in charge would tackle the source material, because if you haven't played the original God of War in a while, you may have forgotten just how wild and how much of a different time it was for that game. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because I personally don't see a problem with it, but it's also no secret that Sony and other AAA game publishers have been trying to avoid controversial subject matter over the last decade or so. God of War was released back in 2005, and the gaming landscape was much less, I guess, politically sour, meaning Sony had no problem with risky scenes front and center at certain parts of the game. Heck, the first God of War game even had a mini game that would never be in a modern Sony game. Plus, the last God of War games have successfully turned the franchise into something with much more mature and I would say more sophisticated tone, thanks to the presentation and storytelling present in the 2018 game and its sequel. By comparison, a quote warts and all remake of the original God of War might seem a tad juvenile, but that was just the time period. I think everyone should kind of just accept that that was the reality, and if they decide to do a remake of this OG game, I would hope that they would try to keep it as one-to-one as possible. But it could be seen as a tad bit juvenile, and I'm not saying that this is a dig on OG God of War, because I think OG God of War is a masterpiece in its own right, but the original and the Norse games are two entirely different games with entirely different tones, and Sony may not be too eager to bring the OG God of War's tones back in its entirety after they spent the last 6 to 7 years reinventing the public's perception of the God of War IP. So the question is how would that content be handled with a modern remake? Would Bluepoint just cut it out entirely, or would they just say screw it and keep it in despite the inevitable backlash from journalists? Personally, I think a warts and all remake is the best case scenario, but it's also not realistic given the modern AAA gaming landscape. Sony doesn't want any kind of controversy with any of their games, but it does seem inevitable that the sex and nudity in the original God of War would receive some kind of serious finger wagging from the gaming outlets, especially if they're remade with Bluepoint's signature lifelike graphics and character models. So assuming the God of War remake is legit, I'm fully expecting all of the risky stuff to be completely removed, and I also wouldn't be surprised if the blood and gore were also toned down a bit from the originals, because again, Sony went out of their way to completely change the way that we look at the God of War franchise. Modern God of War fans expect a more mature tone and deep storytelling, while the original God of War was much more of a high octane and over the top experience. I'm personally expecting the remake to be kind of a middle ground between the OG God of War and the Norse God of War, but that being said, the more extreme aspects of God of War are likely to be sacrificed to accomplish that. Well, what do you guys think about all this? Do you think that the God of War remake is actually happening, or do you think this was just wishful thinking? Personally, I think there's a lot of evidence to support God of War remake existing somewhere at Sony. Maybe things have changed, they just did a round of layoffs, so it's hard to say. Either way, I am personally hoping that we get a remake of at least the first one. And who do you hope is the developer for the God of War remake? Would you want it to be Bluepoint? Perhaps would you want it to be all in-house with Santa Monica Studios? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. Hit the like button if you've enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel with your notifications turned on, and until next time, this has been Wes, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.